Welcome to the second episode of Atlantica's Fuel for Thought, a reimagined energy podcast. This is a podcast where you can learn about all things energy in Atlantic Canada. I'm Jonathan Alward, and I'm the Vice President of Policy at the Atlantica Centre for Energy. Atlantica's goal is to power and develop the region responsibly to create a more prosperous future for Atlantic Canadians. We do this by developing partnerships, facilitating conversations, and improving energy literacy. In this episode, my guest will explore energy trade with me. We'll help listeners and viewers better understand the important role that buying and selling energy with businesses in Atlantic Canada has for the region's energy portfolio and economy. We'll also uncover how integrated the energy sectors are in Atlantic Canada with the New England states and how dependent the two regions are on this energy trading relationship. But before I introduce my guests, though, it's important to acknowledge that today we're recording on March the 6th, and the United States is currently engaged in a tariff war with Canada. While not in effect today, both countries have discussed placing tariffs on energy products, including crude oil, natural gas, and electricity, against imports from the other nations. Some elected officials have gone so far as even discussing the potential to stop certain energy exports altogether if this trade dispute further ratchets up. It's my pleasure now to introduce my first guest, David Chaundy, the President and CEO of the Atlantic Economic Council. The Atlantic Economic Council is a source for independent research, providing insights and ideas that are vital to supporting a healthy, inclusive, and sustainable Atlantic Canadian economy. David has been the President and CEO of the Atlantic Economic Council since 2018 and has over 25 years of experience researching Atlantic Canada's economy, sharing his insights and ideas with numerous publications and presentations to businesses, governments, and other important stakeholders. He is a leader or member of several economic and statistics organizations across the country. He has a BA in economics from the University of Cambridge and a Master's of Science in economics from the University of York, England, among other degrees. Listeners can also find a recent publication of his on the Atlantic Canada's U.S. trade vulnerabilities on the Atlantic Economic Council's website in its members portal. Welcome, David. I'm also pleased to be joined by Michael Pisiferi, the Senior Officer of Public and Economic Affairs from the Office of the Consulate General of Canada to the United States in Boston. The Consulate in Boston represents Canada's interests in Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Michael has worked for the Consulate since early 2023, where he is the lead of energy and environmental policy. Previously, he worked for the Quebec government in Boston in a similar role. Michael holds a BA in Political Science and International Relations. Welcome, Michael, and thank you both for joining me on Atlantica's Fuel for Thought podcast. Before we jump into our conversation, I'd first like to provide a high-level overview of some of the trade-related concepts which many people don't work with day to day. This being Energy Trade 101 episode, let's start there. Different types of energy, like nearly all products and services, are traded or purchased and sold across provincial and international borders every minute. Exports are products or services that businesses in one country sell to customers in another country. This also happens from state to state or province to province, also known as interprovincial trade. A familiar example for exports would be electricity generated by hydroelectric dams at Newfoundland and Labrador being sold to customers in the United States through Quebec. Exports are good because they essentially use money from the customer's country to help generate jobs and taxes in the seller's country. Imports would be products or services that a producer in another country sells to Atlantic Canadian customers, for example. An example of this would be natural gas, which flows largely from Western Canada and the United States through New England and eventually to the Michelin plant in Nova Scotia and thousands of other customers in the region. Imports are often considered less helpful for an economy than imports, but they are still important. To put it simply, we do not or cannot produce everything we use today in Atlantic Canada, from enough natural gas for manufacturing to getting oranges in the winter. A trade balance is the difference between what a country exports and imports. If it imports relatively too much, it has a trade deficit, which can devalue its currency. Tariffs are essentially a tax imposed by a government on certain imported goods or services. Tariffs ultimately drive up costs for customers, especially if imports cannot be produced locally instead. David and Michael, is there anything you'd like to add to these concepts for our listeners?
Sure, thanks for that, Jonathan. I think for the viewers and listeners here, It's important to understand what the role of the Canadian consulate is in Boston. We're one of 12 consulates all across the U.S. responsible for overseeing Canada's trade relationship with the U.S. And so these types of concepts of imports and exports and ensuring free trade and market access for Canadian businesses is our primary responsibility, and that's what we're here in the region to do.
Great. Thank you for adding that important context.
No, I think you did a good overview of that, Jonathan. Maybe just two little points to emphasize. You talked about imports are not bad. We live in a very integrated world economy. We see that in the auto industry. We see that in the energy industry. The two-way flows are very important. And as you mentioned, we do need imports to be able to produce our exports. And that's certainly the case in energy, and it's certainly the case for other products. So I think that's very important for people to keep in mind. And then the second thing, just in the current kind of tariff situation, tariffs put up the prices for the people importing. So in this case, tariffs on Canadian exports are going to be paid by American consumers. However, if they decide they've got other suppliers, that then means that we're going to be selling less and they will go to other suppliers. So the effects of how these current tariffs are going to play out very much depends upon other alternative suppliers in the US. If that's your only source of energy and you can't get another, you're going to be paying that full price in the US. They're going to be paying the full burden. But if they do, that the effects will fall on Atlantic Canada or Canadian exporters. So I think it's just important that that two-way trade is extremely important for both countries.
Yeah, those are great points, David, and I think they're also an excellent segue into our first question. David, do you mind sharing how many goods and services Atlantic Canada exports in total? What percentage of total exports to come from energy products specifically?
Sure. So when we look at Atlantic Canada exporting to other countries, we export in last year, 2024, $40 billion worth of goods. And if you look at energy products in particular, those exports last year amounted to $20 billion. So $20 billion sounds a big number. Let me just put it in a context for you. That is equivalent to over $600 per person per month of energy exports coming out of Atlantic Canada to other countries. So it's a fairly sizable amount. And so when you look at those trade statistics, $40 billion of exports, $20 billion, half of those exports are energy related products. So energy is a big piece of what we do, and it's really coming in this region from two provinces, New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Labrador at this time. And so it's getting close to 65% of their exports are energy related. But for the region as a whole, half of our exports are energy products.
Michael, how do Atlantic Canada's energy exports compare to the rest of Canada? Obviously, we're exporting less to the United States than Alberta, for example, but is it significant in a national context?
It absolutely is significant, and I think we hear a lot in the news, especially about Alberta's oil exports or Quebec and British Columbia's hydroelectric exports to the US. But the reality is that New England and Atlantic Canada share, in many ways, an energy system. This region of the continent, frankly, is incredibly interdependent on each other, and I'll talk about this later in our conversation about just how interconnected we are, whether we look at pipelines and transmission lines. But Atlantic Canada absolutely has a role to play. It's a continental role, frankly, where this region of the U.S. is very much dependent on the exports that are coming out of Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, it's really important context for readers to have, and certainly excited to dive into this a little bit more. David, New Brunswick imports some electricity from Quebec, for example, but can you walk listeners through what types of energy flow in and out of Atlantic Canada from outside of Canada?
Right, so there's a number of different flows and different types of products, so let me do a little bit by kind of sector or facility. So we have in St. John the Canada's largest refinery, and that refinery imports crude oil from the US. About half of it in 2024 came from the US. The other half came from other countries like Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. So we are a big importer of crude oil. That crude oil is then transformed into refined petroleum, gasoline, and other products, and that is exported then. Right now, 95% of those exports actually go to the US. This is why that US market is so important. There are some small sales to other countries. So that's a big part of kind of crude oil coming in, refined petroleum, exports going out. But we do also import some other refined petroleum from other countries, whether it's diesel or some other products that are being used in the local market. So that's kind of the refined crude side. If we then go to Newfoundland and Labrador, that they have 4 offshore fields, and so they're producing quite a lot of oil. Again, right now, over half of that goes to the United States, and a fairly sizable chunk goes to Europe. So we are importing crude for refinery, we are exporting crude that goes to other refineries around the world. And so we've got oil, we then have natural gas. So coming back again to St. John, in St. John there's the LNG terminal. That is largely an import terminal. They import liquefied natural gas, so gas that's been converted to a liquid form. It's then regasified, and that gas is then exported into the US, typically in a kind of seasonal winter market, taking advantage of peak demand. So we have natural gas coming into the region, we're exporting it, but because, as you mentioned, Michelin and other consumers in this region, whether households, institutions, or businesses are using natural gas to fuel their plants and their heating, we also import natural gas, most of that coming from the United States through the pipeline, the Maritimes and Northeast pipeline. And then electricity that you mentioned. So electricity, we have various sources of powering that electricity, but we do currently import coal. So both New Brunswick and Nova Scotia have some coal plants. They're importing coal to power that power. We are then also exporting some electricity from New Brunswick to New England in particular. There's also some export flows, as you mentioned, from Newfoundland and Labrador into the United States. And then depending on the time of the season, we're also importing electricity. So those electricity flows are flowing both in and out of this region. So those will be the key areas: crude oil, refined petroleum, natural gas, and electricity related. Those will be the key energy flows into and out of Atlantic Canada to the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to look at just how diverse the different sources of energy that we're trading are, certainly across the region. You mentioned coal. Even with the phase out of coal-fired electricity generation, that's not really going to reduce our reliance, I don't think, on the need for some specific energy imports to the region by 2030, for example. Most of the electrical utilities are planting, biomass or natural gas, adding new wind. A lot of that energy that will be replacing coal, as an example, will still come from outside of the region.
And maybe just to add to that, because you just triggered a point, we do also sell wood pellets. And some of those wood pellets are going to Europe to help be fuel for power plants elsewhere. So we might be using some of that within the region. But although we don't typically think of that as an energy flow, it's more of a forest products, but it is actually fueling energy and power generation in other countries as well.
Yeah, in England, for example. Michael, can you explain how and where these different types of energies flow in and out of Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, I'm happy to dive into it. And I think before I get into specific energy flows, just putting New England and the 6 states of New England in context for listeners is important. So the 6 states are Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont are all in the northeast corner of the U.S. They share one electric grid, which is somewhat unique. Some states have their own electric grid. In New England, we're 6 states with one electric grid. And the population is just over 15 million. And that population, important for Atlantic Canada, is concentrated in the southern part of the region in Massachusetts and centered around Boston. And when we think about the energy system in this region of the U.S., we're looking at close to 30,000 megawatts of generating capacity locally. And that's predominantly coming from natural gas these days in this region. There's been a pretty significant transition away from dirtier fossil fuels of coal and oil and to towards natural gas, and there's also some nuclear local hydro assets. And Quebec and Atlantic Canada each play a pretty important role in providing electricity to the region. So if we look at Newfoundland, for example, it's about 1 terawatt hour per year, and New Brunswick on its own is providing about 1.9 terawatt hours, which is not so much less than what Quebec is providing, which is just closing in on 4 terawatt hours to the region. This electricity comes across two DC lines with Hydro-Quebec, worth about 2,225 megawatts or so. And then there's two AC ties with New Brunswick, worth about 1,000 megawatt capacity. And New Brunswick Power is in an interesting place because they're providing electricity to 58,000 people in northern Maine that actually are not connected to the rest of the electric grid in New England. So their sole source of electricity is coming from New Brunswick, but there's another 1,000 megawatts or so coming specifically from New Brunswick of electricity that's exported into the ISO New England wholesale market, which could flow all the way south to the load centers down here where I am in Boston or Connecticut. And then, of course, that's just electricity. If we look at oil and gas, Irving's refinery in St. John, New Brunswick, which is Canada's largest, produces about 320,000 barrels of petroleum per day, and over 80% of that is bound for the U.S. market. And this actually represents, which really puts into context the importance of Atlantic Canada to not only Canadian energy exports, but also for New England. This actually represents 50% of all of the gasoline products imported to the U.S. from Canada and 33% of all petroleum products imported into the U.S. from Canada. That's looking at around 80 million barrels per year of refined products exported from New Brunswick to the U.S., and a lot of that does come into New England. So if we look at Irving Oil's exports, for example, it's about 53% of refined petroleum sales to the U.S. every year. And then if we just consider LNG, the St. John terminal is a quite essential part of the energy infrastructure in this region, looking at about just over 24 million cubic meters of natural gas exports from Canada to the U.S. Northeast. That's in 2023, which is the latest data available. And that's through a mix of pipelines that crisscross New England and head up into Atlantic Canada via New Brunswick. And so that LNG coming into our continent does sometimes make its way into New England, but via the St. John LNG terminal.
Yeah, and it's absolutely two-way too, where those pipelines and the pipeline operated by Maritimes Northeast is critically essential from getting gas even all the way from Alberta through the United States up through New England and to consumers in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia in particular, including their Irving Oil refinery as well.
Yeah, something that,
So
Jonathan, we're often faced with, if I can add this in, is New Englanders tend to think of themselves as at the end of the pipeline, so to speak. So when the Canadian consulate is out meeting folks, they'll often share that with us. They view themselves as at the end of the North American or the U.S. pipeline network. We then typically remind them, diplomatically, of course, that actually Atlantic Canada in many ways is at the end of the pipeline, and a lot of the infrastructure going through New England is actually moving further north, and folks in Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick in particular, are dependent on those outflows.
And it's an important reminder too, an important reality, being at the end of the pipeline, regardless of where the end is specifically across the region, it ultimately leads to higher prices. There's toll after toll to get the natural gas further and further into the Northeast. So with that, it's important to recognize that the region does often have higher energy prices as a whole, I would say, than many other parts of the United States or elsewhere in Canada. And when we talk about how interconnected we are, it's, I think, an important piece of making sure that we have reliable energy sources, yes, but also as cost-effective energy provided to customers as possible. And I think right now, looking at how interconnected we are, what potential alternatives are there, if any, all those alternatives would be more costly, and I think that's certainly a big concern from my point of view. David, what broader impacts do you think energy trade has on Atlantic Canada's economy? What would the economy look like without energy trade being possible into and out of the region?
Well, let me just kind of take first kind of trade as a whole and then kind of maybe speak specifically to the energy piece. When you look at, and I'm just thinking particularly in the context of exports to the United States and the current trade dispute we have over 2,000 exporters in Atlantic Canada selling goods to other countries. Those exports last year to the US specifically were worth over almost $30 billion. And those exports accounted for about 12% of our economic output of our GDP, and they're sustaining over 78,000 jobs. So trade, selling to the United States alone, which is our biggest market, almost over 70% of exports go there, yeah, sustains a huge part of our economy in Atlantic Canada. So if we don't have those exports, more generally, that's going to have some fairly serious impacts in this region. And then when you think about energy flows, you think about not just a refinery, not just crude oil production. Those facilities offshore Newfoundland, the refinery in St. John, they are supporting jobs, they're supporting supply chain, people transporting those products by ship or by rail or by truck, other employers and suppliers, people who maintain those facilities. There's lots of what we would call indirect or supply chain impacts, and those people also then spend money in their economy at restaurants, on professional services, on haircuts, going on holiday. So those exports that generate huge amounts of revenues that help sustain our economy. But it's also important to realize that without energy, we would not have power for our heating at home, we would not have power for our lights at home. Our businesses require heating, they require lighting, they require cooling, and they require power to produce products, whether it's a pulp and paper mill. So energy is actually extremely fundamental to our economy. Without energy, without power, we would not be able to drive and get to places, we would not be able to fly to get to places, we would not have the means of transportation, of just daily living. So it's fun, although we don't necessarily realize that, we're driving our cars, we flick our switch, but without electricity, we would have no communications, no internet. So you quickly think when we have power outages, how quickly we realize we are dependent upon energy, electricity, and fuel for transportation and to generate and produce the products that we need. So energy is fundamental. There's certainly broader economic impacts from trade, but energy is critical for our economy even without that trade. Even if we were just isolated, we could not survive in our current framework without the energy sources that we have today.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I think it's important to recognize too, even though there are alternative sources of energy that maybe we can make more of here in Atlantic Canada, like electricity, for example. A lot of manufacturing businesses that are using natural gas, even if it's more expensive in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia than it is elsewhere in North America, that's still a big piece of what makes them their business model cost competitive. And switching to electricity, for example, has definitely benefits. If you look at emission reduction, for example, but it might mean that their business is no longer cost competitive. So just because we have some alternatives doesn't mean there won't be economic consequences to fuel switching, especially if that trade was no longer possible.
Absolutely. And again, if you go back through Atlantic Canada's history, the cost of electricity, particularly for energy-intensive facilities and the pulp and paper mills, a high cost of power as well as a high Canadian dollar back in the 90s, those were key factors leading to some of our pulp and paper mills to close. So energy costs are a key driver, especially for energy-intensive industries. There's labor and availability and exchange rates also play in, but energy for those energy intensive users is extremely important. So having alternatives and having cost competitive supplies can certainly make a huge difference to competitiveness for any business.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the flip side, Michael, you live in Massachusetts. How much economic activity in New England relies on trade from Atlantic Canada, or energy trade specifically?
Yeah, the numbers are really quite astounding when you think about it. And a lot of our work at the Canadian Consulate in recent months, but this is what we do day in, day out, is educating New Englanders to understand, and Americans more broadly, just how dependent they are on Canadian exports of energy to power their economy, on Canadian imports and inputs into goods that are ultimately made in the USA. And that's a big part of our overall US-Canada trade. And when we look at New England in particular, the dependence on Atlantica, Canada is pretty stunning. About 8 in 10 cars on the road in New England actually are powered by fuel coming from Canada. 90% of the jet fuel used at Logan Airport comes from Canada. And Senator Collins of Maine pointed out in some of her tariff advocacy that 100% of the jet fuel and diesel used at the Maine Air National Guard base in Bangor, Maine, comes from Canada. So when we consider how Canadian exports are powering the economy, it really becomes quite clear that our interconnections with each other are very important.
So thank you, Michael. Before we wrap up, I think many listeners have at least some easiness, probably fears about the current trade environment between the United States and Canada. I'm typically optimistic, but we are living in uncertain times, and the energy sector is no exception to this. But I'll ask you both, David and Michael, what does energy trade look like in the future for Atlantica, Canada?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Jonathan, but it's one that I think is quite challenging to answer right now, particularly just with what's happening in the Canada-US trade relationship, but also other shifts happening around the world in terms of what's happening in terms of geopolitics. And also just we've been on a transition, particularly in Canada in this region, to get to a net zero emissions by 2050. We're seeing some shifts in the US around energy and environmental policies. We're seeing some businesses make some shifts. So there's a lot of moving parts right now that make me hesitant to be too dogmatic about what the future looks like. But let me just make a few comments. One, in the current context, people have talked about, Canada, we need to diversify away from the United States. We're too dependent upon this relationship. It's not that straightforward. If you think about some of the energy flows that we just talked about, natural gas relies on those pipelines. Unless we have an LNG export terminal, there's no way we can export natural gas. We don't currently produce any. We are very much reliant on existing infrastructure. And when we think about crude oil, which we export, and refined petroleum, that is heavily dependent upon the US market. Yes, there's other countries that consume those products, but unless we can do so competitively, unless we can get those products to their market and be competitive with other suppliers, we really don't have those alternatives. So it's really not clear to me, particularly in the energy sector. I think we have more opportunities on the crude oil. We already sell a big chunk of that to Europe. But I think with refined petroleum, that might be more challenging to be cost competitive in other markets. So it's not clear to me exactly how some of the energy flows will develop. But I think we also need to think about there's new energy sources that are being developed. Newfoundland and Labrador has another offshore project, Bay du Nord, that may come on stream by 2030. We know that Newfoundland and Labrador is working with Quebec to develop some new hydroelectricity facilities. That might mean more flows going into Quebec, potentially then also to the US market. New Brunswick's trying to develop some small modular reactors, a kind of nuclear power. There's several potential hydrogen projects, wind-powered, converting power to hydrogen, exporting that to Europe, and then potentially offshore wind. So there's lots of new potential energy sources that are being proposed, potential projects that could be quite significant. Some of those may be used domestically, but we have a very small market in Atlantica, Canada. So typically we export energy. And so if we develop some of these, we do need to have export markets, whether that's the United States or elsewhere. And so what happens in this Canada-US relationship over the next decade will probably determine A, whether some of those projects advance, and B, kind of where those markets are developed. So I want to be very careful about trying to project what that picture looks like in 10 years. There's just a lot of moving parts right now, and it's just not clear exactly how some of those may play out and what the competitiveness of those products might be in the new environment that we are moving into.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, what do you think what will energy trade look like in the future for Atlantica, Canada?
Yeah, thanks for that. And to build off David's point, I think it's important for us to focus on the subnational level here in New England and in Atlantic Canada. The reality is that despite some pretty significant shifts that we anticipate and are underway as we speak in federal policy in the United States, the New England states remain largely committed to pretty significant decarbonization goals at every level of their economy, including and especially in the energy sector. And ISO New England, which is our regional grid operator, continues to predict a pretty significant increase in demand for power. Current generation in this region is around 31,000 megawatts, but there's going to be a big influx and need, especially for new interconnections, new generation. There's some focus, of course, on battery storage technology and others, but the reality is that this region is more efficient when it's integrated into the Canadian system. And pretty soon, there will be a new transmission line coming on that links Massachusetts to Quebec via Maine. And there's real appetite from what we hear on the ground here for increased connections and utilizing better our regional energy capacity. There's a few initiatives underway from some very well-respected think tanks that I would encourage everybody to check out, looking at what regional energy policy really looks like and long-range transmission planning on how we both decarbonize and do this in a way that is going to be cost effective for the region. And one of the ways that we do that is by working together. So there's a number of subnational initiatives at work, both within private organizations, but also government to government. And so the governors and the premiers gather annually for the New England Governors Eastern Canadian Premiers Conference. And those conversations, in addition to the big annual meeting, are ongoing between energy policymakers and decision makers in the 6 states of New England and the 5 provinces of Eastern Canada. And so these conversations continue despite changes at the federal level. And I do think it's important to focus on that and to focus on what this region will continue to need in the future. And Atlantic Canada plays a very important role in that conversation, both for traditional energy, but also for the need for balancing generation and renewable technologies that can help feed this region and can complement some of the new generation that'll be online here, including offshore wind, and especially as we look at onshore and offshore wind in Atlantic Canada, that complementarity will be key, and participating in the transmission conversations is essential for the region, both at the subnational and, of course, our 2 countries will continue to talk about that as well.
Very insightful, both of you, and thank you, David and Michael, for joining Atlantica's Fuel for Thought. I encourage all the listeners and viewers to learn more about the Atlantic Economic Council's research on trade and several other topics, including an inventory of major projects being developed in the region and their excellent Net Zero series. You can find links to the Atlantic Economic Council's website in our show notes. Until next time, knowledge is power, so please keep learning about energy. Thank you.